about rationality and foreign policy planning.
Okay. Thank you. At the outset, maybe I would just say that having spent several years preparing the refreshments for events such as this, I'm particularly happy to be on this side of the podium today. My talk today will concern rationality in foreign policy.
You also prepared the library, right?
That's true. Did that too. Yes.
It's
not just the refreshments, right?
Refreshments of the mind and the body.
That's right. That's right. It was a multi-dimensional effort. Okay, so we'll be talking about rationality in foreign policy planning. And by way of introduction, I just want to read a quote that I've placed here, which says that whatever it is that the government does, sensible people would prefer that it do it to somebody else. This is the idea behind foreign policy. In any case, I'm assuming that this session is off the record. The last thing I want is to get into trouble with my boss. Okay. What I'd like to do basically is to draw a comparison between the way policy planning processes are actually conducted in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I work, which I think is similar to the way it's done in other agencies in Israel, whether it's the National Security Council or the IDF or others, and how I think a game theory approach could be applied to similar problems. And by way of an example, I want to maybe underscore some of what I see as shortcomings of the traditional approach and what could be some added value of something closer to a game theory approach. I'll then point out a few obstacles, both intrinsic and practical obstacles to actually incorporating game theory in real policy planning processes, and then try and provide some words of assessment. Okay, so this is essentially quite trivial to this audience, but I will explain it in any case. How would we apply game theory to the framing of a policy planning process? Essentially, we have to do two things. We have to define the game and then analyze the game. It's clear. In defining the game, we have to identify who the players are. We'd have to identify their relevant action sets. We'd have to identify any relevant states of the world. In other words, any exogenous variables, environmental variables, which aren't interactive elements in the game, which also might have an effect on the outcome. And we would have to then define the preferences of the players regarding the resulting outcomes. And then in analyzing the resulting game, we would want to identify the equilibria and preferably, if possible, try to decipher if any course of action by the client, meaning the person or individual who's commissioned the analysis, emerges as especially attractive or advisable, which isn't, of course, guaranteed. For example, if it turns out that there's a dominant strategy, or if there are many equilibria, if equilibrium refinements can point out certain equilibria which seem more preferable from our client's point of view than others, if we can somehow characterize the different equilibria in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, and so on, then this could be of use to the decision maker. What are the advantages of doing all of this? Well, for one thing, it provides a systematic description of the relevant aspects of the situation. This is not something that the more traditional approach guarantees. It could sometimes approximate it, but in a far less reliable way. This approach forces us to impose transparent assumptions on our analysis. We have to be very clear about who we've said the players are, what their actions are, and so on. And again, assumptions are something that are always imposed, even in the regular, more heuristic approach that is actually the one that is employed most of the time. But the assumptions typically are less explicit and often not complete to the, people aren't completely aware of them. What this provides us with, of course, is a more sophisticated analysis of interactivity. If we have constructed the game, then we have machinery through which to properly analyze the interactivity which is brought to bear. And this could lead, doesn't guarantee, but it could lead sometimes to counterintuitive or insights that would otherwise go unnoticed or unseen. So I think these are the advantages of employing game theory.
Isn't that when you compare this to what you call the usual way,
well, yeah, the traditional approach. It's not clear what that is, but
it's not only that the assumptions are transparent. I think it's done at a different level, which means this is at a very basic level of saying the players' actions, payoffs. Then they say, oh, he's going to do that, and I'm going to do that, and that's which is our conclusions from that. It's a much different level, I think, than this is, which is a very basic level from which you may deduce that.
I agree with you. I think that's what I mean by they're not explicit. The assumptions exist in the way that it's actually done day to day, but they're implicit. They're, as you say, they're at a much higher level. You could maybe infer what the more basic assumptions are, but or not. I agree. Yeah. I think that's quite true. Now, going to how, what's this traditional approach? There are, of course, many different traditional. There isn't one monolithic way that it is done, and there are more systematic and less systematic ways. But I think this captures what the aspiration typically is, at least in the foreign ministry. If you're commissioned, if you're told to draw up a policy paper, you try to go about it more or less along these lines. The first thing you do is define the problem. Why do you even have to have this paper? Why have you been requested to analyze something? So for example, one thing could be Israel, or we have a feeling that Israel's volume of trade with a particular country is lower than we think it could be or should be, lower than its potential. So that's the problem. We would then define the goal with respect to the problem, which in such a trivial case would be to increase the volume of trade, for example. We would then try to define evaluative criteria, in other words, criteria by which to assess the different policy options. And there is a very broad range of possible criteria, but typically we can probably branch them into three coarse categories. One is the policy, this proposed policy effective with respect to the stated goal. Is it feasible? It could be feasible either legally, financially, politically, diplomatically, etc., bureaucratically. And the last thing is whether it causes other problems. So, grosso modo, these would be three main branches of criteria, which of course in any given case would be specifically described. We could then define, or we should define, the policy options. What is the toolkit of possible courses of action that we can employ? And then we analyze the policy options according to the criteria. We superimpose the criteria for each of the policy options and try to deduce a recommendation. Yes?
Your criteria can describe both good and bad models, since you don't speak about the criticality of the, for example, presentations of the goals. Okay? One of the problems in game theory is that sometimes we don't discuss the reality of our assumptions, even when we make applicable models. Okay? And your criteria does not reflect this demand. Okay? So it is maybe necessary conditions, but it is not sufficient to have a good model.
Yeah.
You can have that problem, incorrect goals, and still have a model.
Okay. This procedure typically wouldn't be formalized at all. It's not formalized. There's no formal model in the standard approach. That's part of what I'm trying to point out, is that it's done in a more vague or heuristic manner. But I don't think that there's nothing necessarily limiting the kind of, if I've understood you correctly, the kind of criteria we can suggest. You're free to suggest any evaluative criteria which you think are relevant or pertinent, and then you can analyze them. So maybe I misunderstood you.
I've freedom of speech, so I am free to suggest, but the point is that we wish to suggest good criteria.
Okay, but then we can limit ourselves to only those criteria which we would consider to be good. I don't think this is necessarily precluding that. Again, unless I misunderstood. But in any case, as I say, it's not meant to be formalized. The standard procedure is more or less along these lines and is done in natural language. It's not, it doesn't constitute a formal model. But nevertheless, this is what's actually done, or this is the good case. This is what it's aspired to. What is actually done is actually short of that.
There is a, sorry, the one before, the analyze policy options sounds like say, well, but how do you analyze policy options? I mean, it's a game. It's not a single person decision problem. So here, it's the whole world is there in that bullet.
This is part of the problem, and what actually happens is they do analyze we do analyze the policy options, but without constructing a game or without paying attention to the fact that, as you said rightly, it is a game. You're treating it as, I guess, I don't know, a linear programming model, or you're treating it as something which...
The one person way of
well,
I know what I do, I know what the outcome will be, or what's something.
Well, no, but you have different options, and you try to list the advantages and disadvantages, and you're trying to assess, well, overall, which emerges as particularly better or worse. Even that you can't always do, because part of the problem is that it's too vague. It's too vague to responsibly reach a credible or compelling recommendation, I think. But you're quite right. That's part of the problem. That's my point, actually. One of my points. In any case, this is what we try to do. In practice, what often does happen, and these are, again, it could be that in economic decision scenarios it's easier because the things are clearer. With foreign policy scenarios, it's typically even difficult to define properly or in an agreed manner the problem, for different reasons. Partly because you'll have disagreements between the policy planning team themselves over what exactly the problem is or what its confines are. And I think one of the main problems is a time horizon problem. As you can imagine, foreign policy planning scenarios in Israel come very rapidly, and they're usually in crisis mode. And so there's a natural tendency to bound the discussion or the analysis to pretty much the short term. Now, you're looking at the short-term implications of the problem and of whatever policies you're contemplating to address it. And I think clearly any given problem, if looked at in terms of its long-term implications, would not necessarily have the same properties as it does as a short-term problem. And so already at this level, it's often quite problematic to have an agreed-upon definition of what the problem is. The case of augmenting trade is a simple one, of course, but that's usually we wouldn't even bother to have a policy analysis for something like that. But the real problems are, of course, more complex. Another problem is that the criteria are not always explicitly spelled out or ranked. Even supposing that we've specified clear criteria for what makes a policy more or less effective or feasible, it's very rare that in a real policy analysis situation we will be able to rank them and say, well, this policy that we're contemplating, it can improve our diplomatic relations with state A, but it's likely to negatively impact our diplomatic relations with state B, C, and D. Which is more important? It's very rare that we can confidently and have an agreed upon assessment of how to rank those things within a policy planning team. So it's problematic to even rank the criteria, which of course will make it very difficult to analyze the options for which are better or worse. The policy options typically are well defined. We usually have a pretty good grasp of what the toolkit at our disposal is. But the analysis of the options is not always systematic or explicit. What you would expect, or what even the ideal policy planning approach would tell us, is that we have to list our policy options and sort of counterpose the different criteria and exhaustively look at each criteria for each policy option and then compare. That's typically not done in a systematic or an exhaustive manner. It's done usually in a more heuristic way.
Yeah, I want to comment that even in the ideal case that everything is very well defined and you know the players and their motivations, usually often get a game that is you can't handle. Like it often in foreign affairs translate to some sort of game of the chicken. Now we understand the game of the chicken perfectly and we know its equilibria, but what help is that? You know, in game of the chicken, there's two equilibria. Either you chicken out or the other guy chickens out, or there's a disaster. That's a third possibility. But what help is it to understand the situation? I mean, do you agree in advance, we are not going to back off and let the other guy back off? That's really there's nothing to, you understand the situation perfectly, but it's no help at all in succeeding.
We did have an example yesterday. U.S. government and the banks playing a game of chicken. And once you understand it's a game of chicken, you know it's a problem of pre-commitment.
Right. And you can do all sorts of tactical things which constitute pre-commitment, for example. That's one example which would be relevant in chicken, but okay, chicken is an archetypical type of game that, as you say rightly, we understand and we're familiar with. But in general, we have any kind of general foreign policy making situation. The question is, if we try to translate it into a formal model and then analyze that model, would that be in any way useful? I think that sometimes it could be useful, but it's not necessarily always useful. You're right.
But do you have any sort of general framework of prescription, like short-term, middle-term, and long-term policy goals?
Very rare. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say you never have time horizons considered, but it's very rarely the case. And one of the reasons, as I say, is usually we're commissioned to sit down and try and deduce recommendations for the political echelon when there's a burning crisis on the agenda and you have to give answers quickly. You have to give a recommendation by tomorrow morning to whoever wants it. So it's very difficult often to really spread out that far. Sometimes you have longer. You have many months often for something that's impending.
Yeah.
One example is the whole question of Palestinian declaration, unilateral declaration of independence and the bid at the UN. This is something that was foreseen almost a year in advance. Plethora of analysis and papers were ongoing. So that's one instance where you have more time at your disposal. So the answer is sometimes we do that, but you can't always do that. I think all of this comes down to the fact that, okay, sometimes recommendations are provided, but often they're not. Often what will happen is we'll have different policy options. The pros and cons will be assessed in some more or less heuristic manner. And there won't even be a recommendation. It'll be a description of the pros and cons as the analysts see it, and then basically give that up to the decision maker to make the decision. And it may be understandable, given the murkiness, the general murkiness of the analysis. It's difficult to confidently provide a sound recommendation. But I think most problematically, and this is what Sergio pointed out, interactivity is very rarely, and I'm being generous, very rarely accounted for explicitly or systematically. And this, of course, can lead to errors and misleading conclusions. So I want to point out, if there's an example, one simple example, which I think illustrates the problem. I'm deliberately taking an abstract scenario. Suppose that state one, the client, has to decide whether to develop ties with the opposition elements in its rival, state two, or to refrain from doing so. State two, the assumption here is that state two is conducting a foreign policy which negatively impacts the interests of state one. So state two is doing things that state one doesn't like. State one doesn't like the status quo, and it's contemplating whether meddling in the internal affairs of state two can be useful or not. On one hand, it wants to do so because this could force the elite in state two to divert resources away from its problematic policies towards contending with this new internal threat, to the extent even perhaps of regime change ultimately. On the other hand, its main concern is that by doing so it could be forcing state two into the lap of its arch nemesis, state three, which is very bad. That's even worse. I mean, as bad as state two's behavior is from the point of view of state one, the assumption here is that bringing state three into the picture would really be bad. That you don't want. So that's the basic situation from state one's point of view. Its main concern is with, in other words, looking at the two things it wants. It wants to affect state two and neutralize its negative behavior, but it doesn't want to do that at the price of pushing state two into an alliance with state three. And two is only going to seek the alliance to counteract one's meddling. In other words, two, it's asymmetric. Two is happy with the status quo. It's happy pursuing whatever policies it's pursuing. It prefers not to go into an alliance with state three because such an alliance bears costs. State three doesn't give its alliance for free. It's going to want something which state two would prefer not to give. But if it's forced into it, it'll do it because otherwise it runs the risk of regime change and falling from power. Okay, so this is the basic situation. How would the traditional approach, given this situation, state one commissions a policy analysis, how would the analysis look according to, call it the standard approach? The problem is simple to define. Two is following a foreign policy which negatively impacts one's regional interests. The goal for state one is to neutralize this negative influence by supporting its opposition, to divert resources, and hopefully even at the extreme to even elicit a regime change.
That
Yeah.
should be the goal, the method, the measure.
Well, we want to neutralize 2's negative influence.
Yes.
It's true. You're right. I've simplified it by already placing the considered policy in the goal. I think you're right that should probably not be there. But I sort of anticipated the simple model that I'm going to propose. Let's assume that there are 3 for the case, again, for the sake of simplicity, there are 3 evaluative criteria. Is the policy effective? Is it feasible? And does it create other problems? With the assumption that we're placing here is that the fear of this 2-3 alliance outweighs whatever benefits can be attained through meddling. So if we place this in a table, we have the 2 policy options. State 1 can either meddle or not, or do nothing. And the 3 criteria are whether the policy is effective, feasible, or does it cause other problems. Now with respect to the efficacy criterion, meddling would be more effective than not meddling in this sense, in terms of advancing the goal of neutralizing 2's influence. So with respect to the effectiveness or efficacy criterion, meddling would be more highly preferred. We can assume that both are equally feasible. The status quo and meddling, they're both feasible policies. So there would be indifference between those 2. And with respect to the other problems criterion, meddling, because of the likelihood that it would induce a 2-3 alliance, would be more would be less preferred than not meddling. Now, given the assumption that the 2-3 alliance outweighs the benefits of meddling, the recommended policy, according to this analysis, would clearly be to stick with the status quo. Don't risk meddling because you risk that alliance that you don't want. Yes?
I believe that from the point of view of game theory, this is
That's my point, yeah.
That's a bad way to do it.
That's the bad way.
It's an example of the bad way to do it.
It's going to suggest.
So don't criticize it.
But I agree, yeah.
That's the way they do it now.
This is an idealization of the way we would like to do it now, to be more accurate. We don't even reach this, I would say.
Yeah, but possibly we're talking about different things. I'm talking that the threat of the 2-3 alliance is an idle threat because 2 does not really have the motivation. He can make the threat, but from the point of view of game theory, he's not expected to actually activate the threat because there's no motive to do it.
Oh, well, I'm not sure. Let's build the game and then we'll see if that's the case. Yeah.
That's the next slide?
That's the next slide, yeah.
So let him go to the next slide. Wait.
It's not a game yet. That's, yeah. Part of the problem is that there's only...
You are saying the same thing that he's saying. He's criticizing this approach. So let's see what he's proposing. Then you can criticize.
Right. You're not supposed to quote me that I'm criticizing the existing approach, remember?
I'm not criticizing the approach. No, I think this is a very realistic way of looking at it. I think that game theory looks at it differently.
Yeah, that's what
Maybe I'm criticizing game theory. I think the...
Yeah?
Okay. Let him continue.
Well, yeah, okay.
Why is this not what we usually call decision-making under uncertainty? In other words, meddling is a gamble in which there's a probability that you'll be better off and there's a probability that you'll be worse off than by doing nothing.
Okay.
Because they didn't say any probability. Why did you hear probability?
Yeah, that's, I mean, and you won't find that also in the actual policy planning
Why
process.
not conceptualize it as decision-making under uncertainty
It could
rather
be.
than as a game?
I'd have to give thought to that, and maybe you're right, that that's another way to do it that's not being done now, which is better than now. But I think even now we can point out how game theory could improve the current system or the current methodology. But you're right, there may be other ways too. I don't think necessarily that it has a monopoly on, game theory would have a monopoly on what the best thing to do is, but I do think it captures the interactive aspect, which maybe other methods do not. Okay, so how might it look as a game? So as a game, it looks like this. We have state 1 and state 2, where state 1 can choose between meddling or not, and state 2 can choose between striking an alliance with 3 or not. The preferences encapsulate the assumptions that we impose, in the sense that state 1's most preferred outcomes are those in which state 2 refrains from an alliance. So both of these outcomes are better, this one and this one, than the other two. we can assume that it's a simultaneous one, because that, of course, makes it an even more complicated model. But again, in the traditional approach, you're not going to get into those questions of sequential or simultaneous. So state one prefers the status quo outcomes, but all else equal, it prefers to meddle than not, because the status quo is unfavorable. So it doesn't like the status quo. But the best thing for it would be, and this is why this is 4, it would like to meddle to unnerve state 2 without pushing it into an alliance. That would be the best. From state 2's perspective, these ordinal rankings also capture its preferences as we assume them. The best outcomes for it are when state 1 rather, refrains from meddling. So these are the best outcomes. But as long as state 1 is in the status quo, it also prefers. That's its most preferred outcome. So it's not just prisoner's dilemma. There's an asymmetry here in the game where state 2 prefers the status quo, whereas state 1 does not. This is basically the game version of the same decision-making situation. And we can make 2 observations immediately. The unique Nash equilibrium is over here. And moreover, meddle is a dominant strategy for state 1 in this game. Yet the conventional analysis told us to stay with the status quo. So already just translating into a game, it pointed out that there's something problematic about the recommendation we derived with the traditional approach. And I think that the trouble here is that the conventional analysis included an implicit appraisal of 2's best replies to 1's policy options. By assuming that when 1 meddles, you're going to end up with a 2-3 alliance, you've basically you've planted your assessment of what 2's best replies are into the table already. So there's an implicit grasp of what 2's best reply is, but it doesn't say anything about 1's best replies to 2's policy options. It's not even in that conventional analysis. It's an entire dimension which is simply absent from the analysis. It's not there, even implicitly. And I think this prevents the analyst from seeing the whole strategic picture. You're seeing just one aspect of it. And in this particular example, of course, it's just an example, but it prevents the analyst from realizing that the recommended policy happens to be a dominated strategy, which might still make sense, maybe under certain circumstances, but it's cause for concern. And the outcome that would arise from that recommended strategy is probably unsustainable for the simple reason that it's not even in equilibrium.
But I think we raised a very relevant point. This is a sequential game. And given it's a sequential game, your dominance is not relevant.
Okay, but...
Because it's not that state 2 starts talking to state 3. The alliance is not going to happen unless, look, there may be a different story.
It might.
Not in your story, where the alliance is going to happen regardless of what, independently, and before you decide whether you start talking with the opposition in state 2.
It might, because it might realize, I'm not saying it will, but it might realize that staying in the status quo is unsustainable. Why? Because state 2 knows that the status quo is not good for state 1. It's aware of that. And you can have intelligence which tells you as much. If you're in state 1, you might know that state 2 knows that you're not happy. Okay? That can happen. And in that case, state 2 might be wary. It says it knows that state 1 has this incentive to try and find a way to wiggle out of the status quo. Maybe we should preempt. And we might have an incentive to go over the lines just out of the fear that that could happen. So I agree with you that there's sequentiality considerations that have to be taken into consideration. I think that only strengthens my basic point. My interest is not with the example, it's with the fact that the traditional approach is inadequate. And that if anything, we need a more sophisticated approach which can grasp this idea of sequentiality and point out its merits.
But it doesn't preempt. It doesn't preempt. Even if state 2 has intelligence that state 1 might want to meddle, and state 2 therefore brings forth earlier that alliance with 3, that doesn't preempt anything, because as you showed us, meddle is preferred to status quo either way.
Well, no, but I think what it would preempt is this. You don't want to end up here. I mean, again, the model would get more, the case would be more complicated, and the model would have to be more complicated to embody the fact that what might happen is that there's a first move advantage.
It is sequential. If I play SQ, I play first, 2 plays second, then I play SQ, we are going to get to the 3-4. I prefer that than playing that which gives it 2-2, which gives it 2. Okay? So if it is sequential, we are going to get to SQ.
Depends who's first.
If 1 moves first and 2 moves second, The equilibrium is a straightforward box which is SQ.
But that was
Very different equilibrium.
that was analysis of the story.
I mean, it
Yeah.
happened to.
Sure,
It happened to.
We
it
have
happened to
1 minute,
compare with
Sergio.
that.
Okay.
You have 1 minute.
Or 1 minute. Okay, so let's cut
Decide
to
what
the
you
end here.
want to do.
All right, so I think the point I'm trying to make is that game theory can enrich our analysis and understanding of the complexities of the policy making situation. What's the trouble? Or rather, what are the main obstacles to doing this? Okay, even if it has merit, the obstacles are difficulty essentially specifying the game. Again, we come back to clear disagreements about who the players are, which players need to be incorporated as interactive players and which we can assume are sort of part of the background to simplify analysis, because it can quickly get out of control. Most real foreign policy situations are not two-player games. They have numerous players, but you'd have to be judicious in choosing who to include as an actual player. What are their feasible and relevant actions? What other factors need to be taken into account? And so on and so on. How do we rank the outcomes? And maybe more than anything, how do we know that our characterization resembles, never mind is equivalent to, the other side's characterization of the situation? So would it be sound to assume common knowledge of the structure of the game? Not clear. Aside from these intrinsic obstacles, thank you, we'll just finish. There's 1 or 2 more slides. In practice, there's very widespread unfamiliarity with the terminology of game theory and with all of these things, and very even wider spread skepticism as to its relevance and validity. Even here, of course, we heard that skepticism. I'm not sure I'm completely party to that skepticism entirely, even though it has some merit. But in any case, this is the situation is, if I were to try and present this to the foreign minister or to the policy planning bureau, to start drawing matrices and game trees, they would basically just nod politely, and that would be the end of it. I mean, they wouldn't get very far. So the question is it relevant at all? And